Welcome. My name is Christy Gavella, and I am Senior Advisor and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Associate Professor of Japanese Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to moderate today's discussion on potential lessons from Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. Steel. This acquisition turned into a dramatic foreign investment saga, from its politicization during the 2024 presidential election to President Biden's decision to block the deal on national security grounds to President Trump's eventual approval of the deal in June of this year. The acquisition made them the world's second largest steelmaker, but as part of the conditions for approval, the two companies had to reach a national security agreement that notoriously included giving the U.S. government a golden share in U.S. Steel, which granted it veto power over important management decisions. And that golden share has already been used once, so the situation is actively evolving. In September, the U.S. government blocked a plan to stop production at a U.S. steel plant in Illinois. So today we're hoping to dig into this deal and its broader implications. So, for example, to what extent should other foreign companies who are considering investing in the U.S. Be worried about encountering the same challenges as Nippon Steel? Does the U.S. government's golden share set a precedent? And what are the implications for future U.S. policy and U.S. Japan relations? To discuss these questions, we're really joined by a fantastic lineup of experts today, who I'll introduce very briefly. Dr. Kei Shimizu is Research Assistant Professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research deals with a variety of issues related to political economy with a focus on East Asia. She's the co-author of Betting on the Farm, Institutional Change in Japanese Agriculture, and the Digital Transformation and Japan's Political Economy. I have to also take a moment to thank Kay for reaching out to me about organizing an event on the Nippon Steel deal, which I had also been following closely. So I'm glad that we could collaborate on conceptualizing today's event. Next, we have Dr. Michael Beeman, who is lecturer at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. He was a senior U.S. trade official at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative for over 16 years, most recently as assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC, during which time he led the negotiation for the U.S. Japan Trade Agreement and the renegotiation of the U.S. Korea Free Trade Agreement. He is the author of Walking Out, America's New Trade Policy in the Asia Pacific and Beyond. Next, we have Sarah Bowerly-Dansman, who is Associate Professor of International Studies in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. In 2019 and 2020, she was Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, during which time she worked in the U.S. Department of State as a policy advisor in the Office of Investment Affairs, where she staffed the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, known as CFIUS. So she's the author of Merging Interests When Domestic Firms Shape FDI Policy. And last but not least, we have Dr. Shujiro Urata, who is Professor Emeritus at Waseda University. He specializes in international political economy and has held a number of distinguished positions, including at Brookings, the World Bank, as Chairman Emeritus of the Research Institute of Economy, Trade, and Industry, and many other things. And he's published extensively on international political economy issues. So we really have a fantastic panel here with us today. So I'll start out by inviting each of our panelists to spend just a few minutes giving us their take on this topic, and then we'll open it up for questions from the moderator and from the online audience. If you're watching us live online, you can submit questions via the CSIS event page throughout the session, so please don't hesitate to submit your questions. With that, I think I'm going to turn first to Kay. Please.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and good evening to those of you who are in Japan. Thank you, Christy and CSIS, for sponsoring the event, and of course to my fellow panelists for joining me today. I'd like to begin with a few thoughts from here in Pittsburgh, which is where I sit right now. To the extent that Nippon Steel's bid to purchase U.S. Steel was politicized from the very beginning, I think an understanding of Pittsburgh's local concerns, political, economic, but also environmental, social, is really critical to understanding why the bid initially stalled, and maybe also how the impasse was eventually overcome with Nippon Steel issuing the much discussed golden share. So first, especially for our viewers from Japan, I think it's important to note what a critical role Western Pennsylvania plays in U.S. presidential elections, especially in recent cycles. While the urban center of Pittsburgh, which is where the university here is situated, is predominantly Democratic, the surrounding suburban and rural areas are much more conservative. particularly in the historically industrial Rust Belt area, which is where steel production occurs. So Western Pennsylvania's demographics also have evolved significantly. It has a large population of white voters without college degrees, which of course is a key demographic for President Trump, particularly in the region's declining steel, coal, and manufacturing towns. At the same time, suburban areas around Pittsburgh, which was once really solidly Republican, have trended more Democratic in recent years, a pattern which also plays out in Philadelphia's suburbs, the other major city in the state. So as a result, presidential candidates often use Western Pennsylvania as a backdrop for appealing to working class voters who have experienced economic hardship due to industrial decline, symbolized by steel. So the populist message and promises of economic recovery can really resonate strongly in this region. Given this political backdrop, what are people in Western Pennsylvania, particularly in the Rust Belt, most concerned about? I would break that down into three things. First and foremost, jobs, and then safety, and then, of course, a cleaner environment. And I'll start off with jobs because I think this was the most critical for this deal. From the very beginning, one of the greatest concerns for workers in Pennsylvania, and especially in the Pittsburgh area, was job retention. But that said, approximately 31,000 workers are directly employed in iron and steel mills manufacturing across Pennsylvania, which is about a $33 billion industry, which includes over 11,000 industry jobs in the Mon Valley region, which is where the U.S. steel manufacturing is centered here. So but there are broader economic impacts, of course, of the steel industry, not just the direct jobs involved in the steel industry itself, but maybe there is a multiplier effect. And scholars generally think of that to be about 120,000 jobs in total across various sectors. But if you think about these numbers, it's actually less than 1% of the working population of Pennsylvania. However, the cultural and political significance of steelworkers in Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh remain considerable. I mean, after all, this is a city where our beloved football team is named the Steelers for a reason, right? And furthermore, I think another critical point is that wages for work in the primary metals, steel included, are about 20 plus percentage points higher than private sector wages in other industries, which makes these jobs highly desirable. So the main resistance to the acquisition really came from the United Steelworkers Union, which represents about 850,000 workers across the country, which included even some from Nippon Steel itself. And the union called for U.S. Steel to remain a domestically owned and operated company, despite Nippon Steel's pledge to uphold union contracts at that time. So to address this critical issue of job retention, two provisions were included in the final, now much discussed golden share given to the U.S. government. First and foremost was the prevention of layoffs, the agreement which stipulates that layoffs or plant closures will not occur as a result of the acquisition. And then the second part being domestic production guarantees, that Nippon Steel agrees to maintain U.S. Steel's headquarters here in Pittsburgh and to continue domestic production. So these two aspects of the golden share were even already tested just very recently last month when the Trump administration, which was prompted by the USW, citing its golden share, prevented a planned shutdown of operations at U.S. Steel's Granite City Works plant in Illinois. And of course, this is not a local plant here in Pittsburgh, but this usage of the golden share already served to reassure Pittsburgh workers that the mechanism of the golden share protecting their jobs actually works. The second point, I think, is safety. It's well known that steel production can be dangerous, and this issue is of great concern, of course, to workers, but also to the surrounding community. And even before the final deal was signed, Nippon Steel had said it would invest about $1 billion to extend the life of a processing plant near Pittsburgh called Mon Valley Works. But unfortunately, less than 2 months after the acquisition, which happened in June, and the accident happened in August, there was a fatal explosion at this U.S. Steel facility. The blast occurred at a coke plant in Clarendon, which is in the Mon Valley, killed 2 workers, injured about 10. And this coke plant has had other accidents in the past, including a 2010 explosion that killed or that injured about 20 workers, and a big fire in 2018 that halted operation for months. So this accident brought with it the risk of much higher cost increases on top of the 11 billion in planned American investments by Nippon Steel over the next few years. So this is another point that was brought of great concern to the local community. And finally, green technology. The Nippon Steel's president Imai has said that they want to become a pioneer in decarbonization, but the reality here in Pittsburgh and especially in the Mon Valley in particular is that the area remains well known for its really poor air quality. The plant emits something around 200 tons of hazardous air pollution a year into the surrounding community, including cyanides and carcinogens. And the current rollbacks in air quality regulations have kept new clean air rules out of the Mon Valley, but the community certainly cares a lot about the fact that, for example, the Mon Valley still ranks fifth worst in the country for sulfur dioxide pollution and really consistently falls within the top 20 dirtiest locations for fine particulate pollution. So it's probably no surprise that the communities most affected by this air pollution are disproportionately also communities of color, which exacerbates generational health disparities and social inequalities in the region. So along with safety, air pollution and environmental worries are really at the top of the list of concerns for Pittsburgh workers and residents. So how Nippon and U.S. Steel under this new leadership will be able to balance these local needs with its quest to improve efficiency, steel quality, and ultimately profitability is going to be what Pittsburgh concerns are going to be focused on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. I think that's really helpful to give us the local context and the complexities of this steel that are often not really discussed explicitly in a lot of the coverage. So that was great. I'm going to turn next to Sarah to give us her take on this topic, especially considering her background in foreign direct investment and her time at CFIUS.
Thanks, Christy. And I echo Kay's thanks for your organization of this panel, and also thank my co-panelists and audience. Kay did a really great job of outlining the political economy issues surrounding this deal. And as a native of Pennsylvania, as well as living in Indiana here at IU, Indiana is actually the top producer of steel in the U.S. by state. So actually, U.S. Steel has several plants in Indiana. This definitely has a local economic effect in my life. But a lot of what Kay just mentioned is really about the effect of this merger on economic vitality and an assessment of the economic benefits and potential economic costs of the merger. And what I want to talk about is the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, since it is through CFIUS that President Trump imposed mitigation terms on the deal. And prior to that, President Biden had blocked the deal through CFIUS. And CFIUS is not supposed to be an economic benefit test. It's supposed to be a national security test. So as a reminder, I think Christy at the top mentioned that this proposed merger was first announced in December of 2023. And as a reminder, it took until January 2025 for the Biden administration to block the transaction. Through CFIUS. The way that CFIUS works is there's an interagency panel that reviews transactions. Blocks are rare. There have been 10 in the 50-year history of CFIUS, but part of the reason why blocks are rare is because oftentimes if parties realize that a transaction is trending toward a block, they will voluntarily withdraw the transaction. From reporting in the news, it seems that the committee was split on whether to recommend a block or not. My understanding is that USTR, so maybe Michael will be able to talk a little bit about that, but USTR was in the driver's seat of those that wanted to block the transaction, while other agencies were more willing to allow the transaction to go through. And then subsequent to that, that block, when Trump came into office, he started a re-review of the transaction, which doesn't really happen. I don't know if there has ever been another case in CFIUS history that was re-reviewed after a decision. And ultimately cleared the transaction with substantial mitigation measures in place, including, as Christy mentioned, a golden share that provides the president with a list of special rights over U.S. Steel, as well as the ability to appoint one independent director to U.S. Steel's board. So the kind of then question is, well, is this normal in the course of things for CFIUS? And I want to kind of make 2 points. So the first is that while there has been a lot of kind of discussion and perhaps breathless discussion over the use of a golden share in this case, CFIUS has imposed broadly similar measures before through its practice of clearing transactions with mitigation terms. Some differences here is that normally CFIUS operates in the shadows, so we don't hear as much about it, right? And also, normally when CFIUS imposes mitigation terms on a transaction, those mitigation terms are enforced by a CFIUS monitoring agency, which is normally comprised of the agencies from CFIUS that were the co-leads on that particular transaction. And so those CFIUS monitoring agencies are in charge of monitoring and enforcing the mitigation measures rather than the president himself. So, there's, this is much more out in the news than other transactions in the past that were doing broadly similar things. Although another difference is that typically mitigation terms have less proactive rights. So for example, oftentimes there's a right to veto a board member rather than the right to appoint a board member. And in this case, the president has the ability to appoint a board member. The second point, so this is kind of within the realm of what CFIUS has done in the past in terms of imposing mitigation terms, although it's much more public and perhaps a stronger set of mitigation tools that are kind of interjecting the government and the president into operational decisions and strategic decisions of U.S. Steel that kind of have not existed at the same level before. And then finally, this really also represents a substantial broadening of how CFIUS interprets its authority. So as I mentioned at the top, CFIUS is supposed to review transactions to determine if there are national security implications of a foreign acquisition of a U.S. business. And U.S. Steel does not have the markers of what we would kind of traditionally think of as national security. U.S. Steel is not an important supplier in the U.S. defense industrial base. It's not critical infrastructure, although some would say that steel itself is a critical supply, a critical input. There are other U.S. companies that produce steel. U.S. Steel is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the largest in the U.S. And so really what, it seems that the committee was worried about is more of these economic benefits and economic costs that Kay was outlining about kind of political economy concerns around jobs, but also a willingness to think of kind of broader industrial capacity within the U.S. as important as kind of from an economic security perspective. And one thing that the committee, really needs to be addressing, and the U.S. government needs to be thinking about, is how can the U.S. address economic security concerns while still remaining a broadly open economy that attracts investment? We know that the Trump administration continues to insist that it wants to attract investment. This is a large part of what Trump and the new Japanese prime minister have been talking about, is more Japanese investment into the United States. The America First investment policy has also really underscored the Trump administration's interest in bringing more investment into the United States. So the question remains, how can companies based in other countries feel confident that if they invest in the United States, that they can do so on market terms rather than on political terms? Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That's really helpful to have that context for CFIUS and, just how this relates to the typical process and other kinds of rules that have been set. So now I'll turn to Mike. Please give us your take on this.
Sure. Thanks, Christy, and thanks to the other panelists as well. I should be clear, I was at USTR for many years. I did leave USTR in January of 2023, so it was just shortly after the announcement, and so I have no direct knowledge of exactly what happened. I have suspicions, but I don't have direct knowledge. But I think what Sarah, the way she laid this out, is a perfect segue. I do think that there are arguments on different sides. I do think that any foreign bid to acquire U.S. Steel would have triggered a pretty serious review of the transaction. In many ways, in a similar way that if a foreign bid to acquire Nippon Steel would have attracted a lot of consternation and hand-wringing in Japan, met by a lot of efforts to think about how to maybe try and keep that in Japanese hands in some way, shape, or form. So these are not surprising, I think, political realities, as well as with some serious considerations in terms of industrial base and national security to think through. But what I'd like to do is really talk about kind of the changing environment in which this whole thing was dropped into the political debate, with great, I think, points made by everyone so far about what that looked like. One of the, I think, key elements to keep in mind is an issue of legacy. This shows up in the case of Japan, not only in steel, but in auto and other sectors, as bitter feelings really about the past, and about dumping and other anti-competitive or industrial policy practices that led to a long history of shifts and changes in U.S. industrial sector, and the recriminations really, to a certain degree, that still arise in certain communities, as well as in some of the halls in Washington, as well as in the rest. But more generally, it also fell into, so that's just more specific to Japan, it also came at a time when the political discourse was rapidly changing away from supporting and finding a way to support past US's approaches to openness, open trade, open investment, and more about this idea of needing to go back and fix policy mistakes and policy failures that had led to the situation that some of these communities found themselves in, and dependence on foreign supply of a range of products. So that was was coming just at, in the middle of the development of this kind of legacy political argument. A second is, and Sarah alluded to this in a clear way, which is this changing definition of national security, where national security has been broadened out substantially to include economic security of almost any kind, shape, or form you can define. I'll get to that in a second. But it really comes down to not just production, but the sense of economic vitality of industries, of production, of communities, of workers. And then third really is, and that has really manifested itself in not only in trade and the way the trade policy has just been upended over the last few years, but also in investment and this idea of government involvement in a golden share. So I'll get to that in a second. So this has all been fused together in this really fundamentally changed political environment in the United States, which I think is not fully maybe more so now in the last few months, but not fully understood, I think, particularly internationally, which is this political polarization in the United States has really redrawn the political map in some very fixed ways, but particularly competitive when it comes to the industrial Midwest. And this is where you have the election of 2016, 2020, and 2024, and the competition around those constituencies, union households in particular, but also working class and hardworking Americans from that region, and they became a real battleground in those fights, if you will, political fights over the presidency. So we are at a very different political circumstances today, where the traditional center on these issues of both parties is still there, but the power has shifted to the progressive left and then to this new right, or the Trump right, in defining America's goals and objectives. And at least in terms of foreign openness and exposure to trade and investment, a lot of alignment, actually. Sometimes it's very clear, sometimes less clear, over this idea that the U.S., through past mistakes or past failures or whatever, or openness, has been harmed by, and that the harm is greater than the opportunity from maintaining an open posture. And so this is exactly the environment that trade policy, I think it was kind of the leading edge of this, found itself in when the first Trump administration came into being. So I think, and also to me, it's fascinating having been in that position, because I don't think the Trump administration, the first one, came in with a very fixed idea of this economic security as a banner, if you will. It had a lot of goals and objectives that were consistent with it, but it was, I think the steel industry actually was very much at the center of how this evolved in terms of policy, which was the initial use of Section 232 on national security grounds to justify imposing blanket 25% tariffs on steel imports. That was the first tariff action that the Trump administration took, essentially, and needed to use the national security justification in order to impose these blanket tariffs for global overcapacity reasons and China overcapacity and the rest, but as more as a kind of a permanent fix, instead of just stringing out consistent anti-dumping responses to protect the industry. And I've always presumed, actually, that Nippon Steel, after 4 years of the Trump administration, the first 4 years, and then in the first 2 or 3 years of the Biden administration, came to the conclusion that the US market is going to be protected for steel going forward. And the only way to grow and to prosper and to do business in that market profitably was going to necessarily need to be there in some way, shape, or form, and presence. So, and this is exactly what President Trump has been championing, right? This idea that if you put up the tariff wall, then the investment will pour in some way, shape, or form. But of course, this collided because it wasn't just a greenfield investment. We're talking about a takeover of this company that has enormous value in the community, to workers, to history, to the steel industry in the United States, to suppliers and producers, to unions and the rest. So obviously, I think we all understand what those dynamics look like. But I do think that this kind of redefinition of economic security, as we're seeing, that really evolved out of, honestly, I think this use of the Section 232 national security justification and tariffs is now evolving in a new way in terms of this idea of corporate-led or U.S. government, federal government involved, state-led, state-controlled, state-coerced, whatever you want to call it, approach to what investments are being made in the United States. And this applies to both to US companies as well as to foreign companies seeking to invest. And it is a very wild and different approach. One that actually, the tariff thing did not surprise me at all, what we're seeing. This kind of state involvement is, and I think that the Nippon Steel deal with the golden share was, kind of a turning point, if you will, in how this whole role of the federal government in investments and in corporate decisions is going to evolve going forward, and we'll see that as a turning point. So steel is, both in terms of tariffs, in terms of investment, is really at the center of a lot of the fundamental changes that we're seeing today. So let me just stop there. I do think that it was successful, just briefly, because I think ultimately because of community involvement and many workers and others that really lobbied for it. But it was also, I think, successful because it promised additional production, and it promised a growing steel sector in the United States, and that was very much in line with the president's stated goals and objectives. So I think that is why that could ultimately succeed. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael. And we'll definitely pick up on your point about this being part of potentially a broader trend in government involvement in business when we get to the discussion part. So I'm going to turn now to Shu for his perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to join other panelists in thanking Christy and CSIS for giving me this opportunity to participate in a very important webinar. I'd like to discuss this issue from 3 different perspectives: Nippon Steel and the Japanese government, and then from the point of view of U.S. Japan relations. To begin with the Nippon Steel perspective. Well, first of all, I think from these 3 perspectives, we can say this is acquisition case is very successful for the reason that I'm going to discuss. For Nippon Steel, establishing a major production base in the United States is a key part of its global strategy. The company's medium to long-term goal is to reach a global production capacity of 100 million tons of steel. Before the acquisition, Nippon Steel's capacity was 63 million tons. By acquiring U.S. Steel, which has a capacity of about 23 million tons, its total capacity increased to 86 million tons, which somebody, I guess, said about the second, maybe, in the world, only to the China's Bao Steel, which produces about 130 million tons. And giving a strong outlook for the U.S. steel market, and as Mike just mentioned, protected market, and also considering the problem of global overcapacity in steel production, acquisition was a logical and strategic move, I think. So that's from the point of view of Nippon Steel, this was a very good outcome they obtained. From the Japanese government point of view, acquisition was also very important. The Japanese government expected that this deal would help reduce U.S. government pressure to impose high additional tariffs on automobiles in its negotiations with the U.S. government. Lowering tariffs on automobiles was one of the top priorities for the Japanese government because automobile exports make up a large share of Japan's exports to the United States, and also production of automobile is a very important part of Japanese domestic economy. In fact, around 5 million workers, which is about 10% of Japanese total employment, are engaged in the automobile and related industries. So that's how automobile is important in Japan. And during the negotiation, Japanese government, including then Prime Minister Ishiba and senior officials, worked very hard to show that U.S. side how much Japanese companies contribute to the American economy through investment and job creation. So they emphasized that Japan is the largest foreign investor in the United States, creating about 1 million jobs in total, including 500,000 in manufacturing. By the way, these numbers, I guess, depending on who you talk to, you get somewhat different numbers because defining the Japanese companies and defining industries very not so obvious. To demonstrate that the Japanese government values investment as a way to help revitalize U.S. industry, it committed to invest as much as $550 billion in the United States. This is an enormous commitment, considering that the cumulative value of Japanese investment in the US stood at 780 billion. So it's 550 billion and 780 billion at the end of 2023. So it's 550 billion is a huge amount of investment. Well, thanks in part to this strategy of highlighting Japan's contribution in investment, Japanese side believes that the proposed tariff on automobiles was reduced from 25% to 15%. And now let me talk to this. And so U.S. approval of Nippon Steel acquisition, despite the golden share and the reversal of Biden administration's earlier stance, was a positive for the Japan-U.S. relationship. It reflects the Trump administration's view that Japan is an important and trusted ally. That said, the golden share, as many pointed out, could make it more difficult for Nippon Steel to run its business efficiently, since the US government or President Trump could intervene for reasons such as protecting national security or jobs. One key lesson from this case is that Japanese companies can still participate in strategic US sectors, but only if they accept stronger US oversight and commit to supporting US domestic goals, such as job creation, manufacturing revitalization, and supply chain resilience. This lesson applies not only to Japanese companies, but also to foreign investors in general. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. It's important to think about how this one case is linked to other issues and other elements of U.S.-Japan relations more broadly. So at this point, I'll turn to the discussion, and I would just remind our online audience that they're able to submit questions via the CSIS event page anytime, and we will take those under consideration. So first, I think I want to ask a question that I get asked a lot by colleagues from Japan and elsewhere, which is, to what extent is the experience of Nippon Steel with U.S. Steel unique? Like, to what extent do other companies, whether they're from Japan or elsewhere, have to worry about encountering these kinds of political or security-related hurdles? Or is this just really a one-off? Maybe I could turn to Sarah or Kay. Sarah, maybe you could talk a little bit. You mentioned that this was, not really what CFIUS was designed to do, but do you see this becoming more common, or, again, was this rather exceptional due to the context of steel and other things?
Yeah. Well, it is a tough question for a few reasons, but as Kay, I think, really laid out, as well as Michael, there are reasons why steel is in some ways to be generous. And additionally, the timing of the announcement of the deal was unfortunate for Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel, in that it just got caught up in a very challenging electoral cycle. It's important to remember, I'm not sure if anyone mentioned this, but even though President Trump ultimately reversed the decision to block and instead allowed the transaction to go through with these mitigation terms, he was publicly opposed to the transaction during the election. And so there are some elements of this transaction that are unique. At the same time, the second Trump administration has shown, as Michael has also mentioned, a increased appetite and willingness to intervene in market activity in ways that we haven't seen before. So that might be through CFIUS, it might be through export control policy and the announcement that, for example, NVIDIA and AMD are able to sell chips to China, but only if the US government receives a finder's fee for that, right? We also know that, for example, TikTok, which was at first, there was a CFIUS divestment order related to TikTok that was never enforced, and then there was a congressional act put forward that basically set the table for another way of requiring divestment of ByteDance from TikTok. That is also in limbo and going through what seems to be a pretty transactional kind of process of finding a new buyer. And so what I would say is that the more that these tools get used, the more they are seen as legitimate. And so while there, some other types of transactions might not have broken the seal, so to speak, on kind of the very vigorous use of a golden share, I do think that now that we see this, we see that this happened, that the sky didn't fall, that in many respects, Nippon Steel is, happy that the transaction went through and was willing to make these concessions in order to secure the deal, suggests that presidents who are interested in using their leverage as kind of as strongly as possible will continue to find reasons to do so, especially since there are political economy reasons why different interest groups would want them to, right? So it's important to remember that the reason why CFIUS exists is because Congress was getting more and more agitated about certain types of foreign investment transactions. And what CFIUS ultimately did was depoliticize a very political process to allow for a technocratic review of transactions and take the politics out of those determinations. What we see now is that CFIUS, once CFIUS becomes politicized, it's very hard to unring that bell.
Great. Kay, do you want to
maybe I can just jump in here, Christy, and add a little bit to that, in that I think what Michael mentioned about the politics, especially on the ground in the Pittsburgh or Western Pennsylvania area, may be in part unique to this particular transaction, but also symbolizes a general political trend in the United States in recent electoral cycles. So to the extent that this particular example of Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel is maybe an extreme example in one of the most politically contentious areas of the industrial Midwest. But that shouldn't blind us to the fact that the overall political trends in the United States is much more polarizing, and that the use of these tools that Sarah just mentioned is in part for political reasons, right? For these electoral gains. And so I think those two things, the economic incentives and the political, really cannot be separated, that they go hand in hand.
Great, thank you. So I want to take a quick question from the audience. So the question is, how much do you think that Section 232 steel tariffs under Trump and Biden drove Nippon Steel's investment decisions? So if those tariffs went away under a future administration, how do you think this might affect Nippon Steel's investments? So maybe I could direct that toward Michael.
Sure. As I previewed, I think, I always suspected, I don't think anyone has said this aloud from Nippon Steel, but I think it was very clear after the 232 was imposed, and then it was clear that the Biden administration was going to continue that approach, but then they actually opened negotiations with the EU to try and ease some of that, and ended up in a TRQ, tariff rate quota arrangement that improved, I think, the predictability and access for the EU. Japan was not involved at the time. It was done without having even started discussions with Japan on it. So I think Japan felt very left out, and they rushed to try and secure a similar kind of deal that would have improved the situation for Japanese exporters. That said, it was still very much a managed trade, fixed, with higher tariff walls over a certain capacity of imports, and made the bet. And I think, as Shu alluded to, I have to believe that it was a great part of it was motivated by the sense that this protection will continue, that this is a permanent, or at least for the foreseeable future, a permanent feature of U.S. policy vis-a-vis the steel industry, particularly as the global overcapacity problem really is still unresolved involving China and its production and the impact that's having on world prices. And so the only way to be in the market in the U.S. profitably is to be here.
So maybe I'll pick up on that point and then return to a theme that came up in multiple speakers' comments about the expanding definition of economic security to include things like industrial capacity. Sometimes when I talk about this topic, I kind of conceptualize it as saying that, there are no shared definitions of economic security across countries. And when I look at it, I see perhaps, buckets that we could call, resilience and kind of de-risking, and then perhaps another bucket about competitiveness and promoting companies, and then perhaps another bucket about protection, which is really about disadvantaging other foreign entities vis-a-vis your own. And so I think we see mixes of these kinds of things. And this second Trump administration has clearly gone towards more of the protective elements in a big way. But if we kind of think about that and pull on that thread a little bit more, what does it mean for, companies as they're seeing these tariffs? Because presumably now many companies are perhaps having the same kind of calculation that Nippon Steel did about 232 tariffs. They're looking at the U.S., policies and wondering how they are going to navigate this situation. So what kinds of implications do you think we'll see going forward? Actually, so far we've, I think, been seeing kind of mixed reactions from companies as they try to cope. But I'd invite anybody really, maybe Shu, do you want to talk about how Japanese companies are seeing this kind of new tariff environment and reacting?
Right. Well, what we are observing is increasing, geopolitical tensions and risks and so on. They're growing very fast. And it's not just the United States. Japan is also very much concerned with economic security, whatever that means. So, it's throughout the world. And I think that's a trend that we are heading. I should say, unfortunately, that's a trend that we are observing. So if that's the case, it is quite understandable, so to speak, to see the kind of policy that we are seeing in the United States, that is more protection. Well, protectionist may not be the appropriate expression to use here, because protect national security and protect economic security, not to protect, some declining industry. But anyway, that's a trend that we're observing. So I have to say that the companies have to be aware of this trend, and I'm sure large corporations, particularly, they are aware of this kind of trend. So they'll be more cautious in making this investment decision under such circumstances. I think that's a trend that we are going to see in the near future too. Thank you.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that? No? Okay. So then perhaps returning to the question of the involvement of the government in different kinds of business transactions. So it's been brought up several times. I think, Michael, you hit upon it the most directly, and Sarah also mentioned the NVIDIA AMD chip sales and the government taking a 15% cut of that. We also saw the U.S. Taking an equity stake in Intel, et cetera. So this does seem to be a trend, a new trend in the second Trump administration of not just tariffs, but also of the government getting into the business of business and being much more active. So, one question I've been asked, for example, is we also see this in the U.S. Japan trade deal, that there is like a committee process set up to evaluate the investment deals where, the president and a U.S. investment committee get to some amount of discretion over what deals are selected, et cetera. So I've actually also been asked by a number of people whether they could expect that golden shares would be included in these investment deals or things like this. But it's a provocative question that we might consider. But to what extent do we think that this is a real trend? It's a big change for the U.S. I would like to hear if anyone has any reflections on that further.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Unless Michael, did you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Sarah,
Okay.
please.
So when I think about how to, when I think about definitions of economic security, and you're right, Christy, that economic security means different things to different people. I like to think about economic security as an issue around challenges stemming from market failures. So, and most kind of clearly that market failures around the negative externalities of market-oriented decision-making for national security concerns. And so, for example, if we think about the steel industry, kind of what would be a market failure is a kind of sectoral decline in industrial capacity in the U.S. because without government regulation around these issues, without tariffs, et cetera, the concern is that that it's cheaper to make steel in other places. I think steel is heavy materials, have higher transportation costs than a t-shirt, right? So I'm not exactly sure, how far we should take this scenario, but the general idea is that without some kind of government intervention, you're just going to get a further hollowing out of your industrial base because of uncoordinated decisions around how to structure your supply chains, and that this creates challenges for the domestic economy in the case of some kind of in terms of economic leverage by others or readiness in the context of military action, et cetera. And so if we think about kind of that as a way to understand kind of the fundamental economic security problem that the government is trying to solve, then we can kind of understand a lot of what the Trump administration is doing, not all of what the Trump administration is doing, but a lot of it as trying to kind of to alter the incentive structure of firms to be thinking more about resilience in their supply chain, and in particular, localization of their supply chain for these broader national security concerns that otherwise firms won't be thinking about because that's not their job. And so what I think we're seeing is that in the past, there was a focus, in the recent past, there was a focus more on the denying of deals that there was a concern around kind of this hollowing out of the industrial base. Then there was a promote strategy, such as the Chips and Science Act or the IRA, around let's build up capacity in these particular industries, such as chips, such as EV batteries. The steel tariffs are also helping to do that as well for steel. And now there is an interest not just in helping on the supply side, but the demand side. So now we're seeing, again, not as much in steel, but in chips and in EVs and in critical minerals, understanding of that if we build up this capacity, right, that then we still are operating in a global environment in which there's overcapacity. And so there needs to be price supports on the other side. And so that is sort of my kind of general take of kind of what is happening in terms of industrial policy for these economic security concerns. And then the question just becomes, how much can the US government afford to be involved in these things? Because it's costly, right? So at a certain point, the limitations on the extent to which the administration is going to be putting its hands in all of these different industries or specific companies is going to be constrained by their just their fiscal capacity to do so. And also, I think as well, the how far can they push before foreign investors say we'd rather wait on the sidelines because this is too constraining for us.
Sure. If I can just follow up, let me take that just one step further. I'm going to give you a quote. It was an off-the-cuff quote from Ambassador Greer, who's an extremely wonderful person. I know him personally from having been at USTR. But he was asked in an event, so I wouldn't take it further than that, even though some people may. But it was asked at an event about 3 weeks ago if the President Trump would seek a stake in NVIDIA for some of the actions that it was going to pursuing at the time. And in an off-the-cuff way, Jameson responded in the following way, which is say, well, if you talk to President Trump, he'd love a stake in every company that's doing well, which I think was a missed quote, but really, I wouldn't take it as literally, but I think it is incredible insight into exactly what is going on in terms of thinking about how to restructure the U.S. government relationship with corporate America and foreign investors in the United States. One question which is unanswered to me is the degree to which that view is shared by the progressive left, which is at the center of the Democratic Party, and by unions in particular as well. Because while I don't think that, I think the progressives generally have avoided talking about government ownership or involvement in corporations, I don't know that they oppose it. And I think they've been careful not to be criticized, to say it because they'll be criticized. But now we're in a very different, kind of Pandora's box has been opened moment on some of these issues, and as to whether that's new policy turf for that, influential part of the Democratic Party as well. So it's not just tariffs that have found kind of this new meeting of the minds when it comes to, well, the progressives will criticize the Trump trade policy, but, undoing past U.S. trade policy has been at the core of Bernie Sanders' argument and others in the party for decades, actually. And so I don't know that we won't see that meeting of the minds when it comes to this important issue of investment and U.S. involvement and control or influence over how the economy is run.
Yeah, that's an important point. We do see this convergence in certain parts of the progressive left, and also with these more Trump-style populist trade policies as well. So there is some reason to think that these will persist. And I think a theme that's come up in the conversation is definitely that the Nippon Steel deal does seem to have set a precedent. It does seem to be part of a broader process of normalizing certain types of policies and government actions. So, this is something that we'll need to keep watching. I just wanted to invite the speakers. Are there any final points that you'd like to make, or things we haven't covered that you'd like to chime in on in the last couple minutes?
Can I just make one point? I mean, I understand that economic security is very important for all any countries. And one issue is that whether you want to, say, promote economic security by yourself, I mean, stay by the United States alone. If Japan is an ally and the US have other allies too, if you trust allies, why don't you, promote economic security with allies? That means, in this case, I guess Nippon Steel's case, forget about this golden share stuff, because just trust maybe Nippon Steel or trust Japanese government. If that is the case, I don't know whether that doesn't mean the abolishment or of golden share or not. But again, my point, I wanted to make this just one point. Economic security is important, but achieving economic security alone may not be so efficient. It's costly, and that doesn't lead to good international relations with allies.
That's an excellent point. So thank you for adding that. But I think that's been one of the tensions in these discussions of economic security. And that's why it's not just an academic definitional issue. It does matter what threats we're protecting against, because that, helps us understand who we can cooperate with, under what conditions, and what, we're actually trying to preserve. So for the US and Japan, that's a key question moving forward. Kay, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think the other component of this is really now the need for potential foreign investors into the US to really understand local politics and local conditions. There are going to be things that, despite the length of time that Nippon spent in understanding US deals, surprises coming up, including accidents that weren't, part of the schedule, and how that eventually ends up costing them and potentially even the bottom line. And whether or not the US government, decides that this was not worth even being involved in if it doesn't end up being a profitable endeavor in the long run. So, whether or not that fusion and understanding and being able to work well with the local community, especially in industrial manufacturing where localization is so particularly important, I think will determine the success of this case, which really will become a litmus test for potential future foreign direct investment deals.
Great. Yeah, that's also an excellent point. And this is something that companies really aren't used to navigating in many cases, trying to get deep into the weeds of the local communities where they're investing, trying to understand oftentimes a very complicated local context. So it's really a much more difficult environment. Well, we're coming to the end of our time now. So it's been a really interesting discussion. I think there's a lot to think about here, and it's been useful to reflect upon this, just a few months after the deal. We've already learned so much, and so much has happened. So thank you to all of the speakers. Thank you to the online audience, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.